June 26, 1943, 12,000 meters above occupied France. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt was burning. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s had come out of the sun in coordinated waves, and Johnson's fighter, the last in formation, the most vulnerable position, took the first burst head-on. 20mm cannon shells punched through his canopy like it was tissue paper. The cockpit erupted in glass and metal fragments. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his goggles, blinding him. His radio died. His instruments shattered. Then the fire started. Flames erupted from behind the instrument panel, licking at his legs and hands. The smell of burning aviation fuel filled his lungs. Johnson looked at what remained of his windscreen and realized with cold certainty that he had maybe 30 seconds before half-pint that was his Thunderbolt's name. A sardonic joke about the massive fighter's size exploded or burned him alive at 24,000 feet over enemy territory. He tried the manual canopy release. Nothing. The frame had warped from the impacts. He was trapped inside a metal coffin filling with fire, and the only way out was the impossible. What happened in the next 17 minutes would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories of World War II. But more than that, it would become a moment of respect between enemies that defied everything both sides believed about war, honor, and the will to live. This is that story. To understand how Robert Johnson survived what came next, you need to know who he was before that June morning. Because Johnson wasn't just any pilot, he was obsessed with flying since he was 11 years old. Lulton, Oklahoma. The Great Depression. Most kids were worried about where their next meal came from. Johnson was paying for flying lessons with money he earned doing odd jobs at a local woodworking shop. By 12, he was taking solo flights. By 16, he had his private pilot's license barely, tall enough to see over the cockpit, but absolutely certain that flying was his life. When war broke out in 1941, Johnson enlisted immediately. He trained first as a bomber pilot, then switched to fighters, a decision that would define everything that came after. By early 1943, he was a lieutenant with the 56th Fighter Group, stationed in England, flying escort missions for B-17 seconds, penetrating deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. His aircraft was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. And if you've never seen one in person, nothing quite prepares you for its sheer mass. At 7 tons fully loaded, the P-47 dwarfed every other fighter in the sky. Pilots called it the Jug because of its massive radial engine cowling. Some joke that you didn't climb into the cockpit, you put it on like a suit. The thing was absolutely enormous. But that size came with advantages that most pilots didn't fully appreciate until they needed them. The Thunderbolt was powered by a Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower. That massive radial engine had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. Here's what that meant in practical terms. You could lose several cylinders and the engine would still produce power. The air-cooled design meant no vulnerable liquid-cooled radiators to get punctured. Armor plating surrounded the cockpit. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires, or at least tried to. Republic Aviation had designed the P-47 around a single principle: survivability, pilot survival. Not marginal performance gains, not turning radius, not climb rate, bringing the pilot home alive. Johnson had named his particular P-47 half-pint. On June 26, 1943, he was flying his 16th combat mission, escorting B-17, flying fortresses returning from a raid near Paris. His squadron of 48 Thunderbolts had rendezvoused with the bombers over the French coast and was providing top cover as the formation headed back toward the English Channel. Johnson was flying rear guard, weaving back and forth behind the formation to watch for attacking fighters. It was the most dangerous position, exposed, isolated, but someone had to do it. He'd seen the Focke-Wulf 190s climbing from below, but assumed they were going after the bombers. Then they kept climbing, right toward his vulnerable position. and Johnson realized with cold certainty that he was their target. The Focke-Wulf 190s that hit Johnson's Thunderbolt that morning came from JG-2, the German fighter wing that protected occupied France. These weren't novice pilots. These were experienced combat veterans who understood exactly how to attack the massive American fighter. They came in coordinated waves. The first burst shattered Johnson's canopy and destroyed his hydraulic system in one coordinated attack. Imagine being in a cockpit when someone fires 20mm cannon shells through your windscreen. Glass explodes everywhere, metal fragments whip past your face, oil from the engine sprays back, coating your goggles, coating your face. The second wave raked the fuselage from tail to nose. Control cables severed, fuel lines punctured, 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun bullets tore through half-pint's aluminum skin. The sound was deafening, a continuous hammering punctuated by the deeper boom of cannon impacts. Each hit sent shrapnel flying through the cockpit. Johnson felt sharp pains in his hands and legs as metal fragments tore into his flesh. The instrument panel disintegrated, glass from shattered gauges mixed with the oil covering his face. The throttle quadrant took multiple hits, jamming the throttle at full power. Johnson's radio went dead. His compass spun uselessly. Then came the fire. Flames erupted from behind the instrument panel, where hydraulic fluid and fuel lines had been severed. The fire spread quickly in the 100-mile-per-hour, windstream blasting through the shattered canopy. Johnson could feel his gloves beginning to smolder. The skin on his face felt like it was cooking. He grabbed the manual canopy release and pulled with all his strength. Nothing. The frame had warped from the impacts. It wouldn't budge. He tried again, panic rising in his chest. Still nothing. The escape hatch was jammed shut by damaged structure. He was trapped inside a burning fighter, with the fire spreading toward the main fuel tanks. Johnson had seconds to make a decision. He could stay in the cockpit and burn to death. Or he could try something desperate. He pushed the stick forward into a steep dive, using the increased airspeed to blast out the flames with raw airflow. The Thunderbolt plunged toward the French countryside, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. The maneuver worked. The fire went out. But now, Johnson was diving vertically at full throttle with a jammed throttle, no hydraulics, limited control authority. And German fighters still shooting at him. Johnson pulled out of the dive at 8,000 feet. The G-forces pinned him to his seat. Half-Pint shuddered violently as he leveled off, pieces of the aircraft tearing away in the slipstream. He could see daylight through holes in both wings. The right aileron was mostly gone. Control surfaces were shredded. Somehow, impossibly, the engine was still running. The big Pratt and Whitney radial had taken multiple hits, but enough cylinders remained functional to produce power. Black smoke poured from the cowling. Oil continued to coat everything, but the propeller was still turning. Johnson wiped oil from his goggles and tried to assess his situation. He was over enemy territory with a crippled fighter that by all rights should already be in pieces on the ground. His squadron was gone, disappeared during his dive. He was alone, wounded, and being hunted by the most lethal fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. He turned west toward the English Channel, toward home. Every control input produced unexpected results. The stick felt loose, disconnected. Several control cables had been severed, and Johnson was flying the Thunderbolt using trim tabs and sheer willpower. The aircraft wanted to roll left constantly. He had to hold full right stick just to maintain level flight. Then he saw it. One Focke-Wulf 190 had followed him down and was now positioned on his tail, just beyond effective firing range. The German pilot was stalking him, waiting for the crippled Thunderbolt to slow down or lose control. But Johnson wasn't slowing down. He pushed the throttle forward, forgetting it was already jammed at full power. There was nothing he could do to go faster. The FW-190 closed the distance. Johnson saw the muzzle flashes as the German opened fire again. More impacts, more holes appearing in the wings. A chunk of his right elevator tore away. The Thunderbolt bucked and shook, but kept flying. Johnson tried evasive maneuvers, but with damaged controls, his options were severely limited. Every turn bled energy he couldn't afford to lose. The Germans stayed on him, firing burst after burst. Johnson could see pieces of his aircraft flying off with each attack. He started counting impacts out loud, partially from shock, partially to stay conscious. 50 hits, 75, 100. The French coast was still minutes away. Johnson didn't know if Half-Pint could make it another mile, let alone all the way across the English Channel. His hands were burned. Blood ran down his legs from shrapnel wounds. Oil and hydraulic fluid covered every surface. And the German was still shooting. The German pilot was methodical, professional. He would close to within 200 yards, fire a burst, then pull up slightly to observe the results before attacking again. Johnson could see him clearly through the oil-smeared remnants of his canopy. The FW-190 was pristine, undamaged, its mottled grey and green camouflage sharp against the blue sky. 120 hits, 150. Johnson kept counting, his voice hoarse. Each burst sent more metal fragments flying through the cockpit. His left hand was bleeding freely now. A cannon shell had punched through the cockpit floor near his feet, and he could see the ground below through the hole. The engine coughed, missed a beat, then caught again. Johnson's heart stopped. If the engine quit now, he was done. No power meant no control, and the Thunderbolt would enter a spin he couldn't recover from with damaged surfaces. But the Pratt & Whitney kept running. That massive radial engine-absorbing punishment that would have destroyed any inline engine in seconds. Johnson crossed the French coast at 2,000 feet, the English Channel stretching ahead. 18 miles of open water between him and England. The German followed him out over the water, still firing. Johnson was beyond understanding why the Thunderbolt was still flying. The laws of physics should have torn the Confederate aircraft apart minutes ago. The structural damage was catastrophic. The engine should have seized. The controls should have failed completely. 175 hits, 180. The FW-190 moved closer, the German pilot's frustration evident in his increasingly aggressive attacks. He was expending all his ammunition on this lone American fighter, and it refused to go down. Johnson saw the white cliffs of Dover ahead. England, safety, maybe. If the engine held, if the controls didn't fail, if the German ran out of ammunition, if. 200 hits. Then something changed. The Germans stopped firing. The FW-190 slid forward, pulling alongside Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt. For a moment, the two fighters flew in formation, separated by perhaps 30 feet of air. Johnson could see the German pilot clearly through the Focke-Wulf's canopy. The German was staring at Half-Pint, his head moving as he assessed the damage. Both wings were shredded with fabric and metal, hanging in strips. The fuselage was riddled with holes. The tail looked like it had been attacked with a chainsaw. Hydraulic fluid and oil streamed from multiple punctures. It was impossible that this aircraft was still flying, yet here it was, somehow maintaining altitude and heading toward England. The German pilot looked across at Johnson. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the 30 feet of sky separating them. Then the German did something that Johnson would remember for the rest of his life. He raised his gloved hand to his forehead in a precise military salute, held it for a long second, his eyes locked on Johnson's. Then he banked away, heading back toward France, his ammunition exhausted, his fuel running low. Johnson was alone over the English Channel, flying a wreck that had survived over 200 hits and 21 cannon shells, saved by an enemy who had finally run out of ways to kill him. The moment the German pilot saluted Robert Johnson represented something that went far beyond one man's survival. It marked a fundamental shift in how both sides understood the air war over Europe. The German pilot's identity remains debated to this day. Many historians believe it was Egon Meyer, the Luftwaffe ace, who had developed the head-on attack technique that was devastating American bomber formations. Meyer was known for his tactical brilliance, for his professional respect for worthy opponents. He was flying in that sector that day. The methodical, precise attacks matched his known style perfectly. Others argue it could have been any experienced JG-2 pilot who simply recognized that continuing to fire into an aircraft that refused to die was pointless. Whatever his name, what he witnessed that day changed how German fighter pilots viewed American aircraft forever. For the Luftwaffe, the incident became a nightmare scenario playing out in real time. If an American fighter could absorb 200 machine gun rounds and 21 cannon and shells and still make it home, what did that say about German armament? The standard 20mm MG 151 cannon was supposed to be decisive. A few hits should destroy any fighter. Yet this Thunderbolt had taken dozens of cannon impacts and kept flying. German pilots began reporting back to their squadrons about the P-47's incredible durability. The psychological effect rippled through fighter units like a shockwave. When you shot at a Spitfire or a P-51, you could see results. Control surfaces would tear away. Coolant would stream from punctured radiators. Engines would seize. But the P-47 just kept coming. And there was something else. The salute revealed something darker than respect. The German pilot was out of ammunition, possibly low on fuel. He knew it. The salute wasn't just respect for an impossible feat. It was resignation. He'd done everything possible to kill Johnson. Used every bullet and shell. And the American was still flying. What else could he do but acknowledge the impossible and go home? What Johnson didn't know as he nursed Half-Pint across the English Channel was that his survival was proving something Republic aviation engineers had been claiming for months. The P-47 wasn't just big and heavy. It was the most survivable fighter in the European theatre, and word was spreading fast. Johnson's group was operating from RAF Manston as a forward base that day on the Kent coast. He headed there on a direct line, unable to maneuver if he encountered any problems. His landing gear was hydraulically operated. The hydraulic system was destroyed. He'd have to do a belly landing, sliding the 7-ton fighter onto the grass on its belly. Other pilots from his squadron had made it back and were circling the field, low on fuel, but waiting to see if Johnson would appear. They'd seen him go down under the initial attack and assumed he was dead or captured. When they spotted Half-Pint approaching the field, trailing smoke and oil, barely maintaining altitude, the radio chatter was incredulous. Johnson set up for his approach. With no hydraulics, he couldn't lower his flaps. That meant he'd be coming in fast. The damaged control surfaces made precise flying almost impossible. He'd get one chance at this landing. He lined up with the grass runway, the Thunderbolt wallowing through the air like a wounded whale. The engine coughed again, and Johnson's grip tightened on the stick. "Not yet. Just a few more seconds. Give me a few more seconds." Half-Pint crossed the runway threshold at 140 miles per hour. Too fast. But Johnson had no choice. He cut the mixture, shutting down the engine, and the big fighter settled toward the grass. The impact when it hit was brutal. The Thunderbolt slid across the field on its belly, metal shrieking, dirt and grass flying. It slewed slightly left, then right, before finally grinding to a stop in a cloud of dust. Emergency crews were already running toward the aircraft, fire extinguishers ready, medics preparing for the worst. When they finally got the jammed canopy open and pulled Johnson out, they were stunned he was conscious, let alone able to walk. His hands and face were burned. Blood soaked through his flight suit from multiple shrapnel wounds. Oil and hydraulic fluid covered every inch of him. But he was alive. Then the ground crew began examining Half-Pint, and the true scope of what had happened became clear. The maintenance crews and engineering officers who examined Half-Pint that afternoon at RAF Manston couldn't believe what they were seeing. The damage was beyond anything they'd witnessed on an aircraft that had made it home alive. They started counting holes. The initial tally was overwhelming. After 2 hours of careful documentation, they stopped at 200 bullet holes and 21 cannon shell impacts. The actual number was likely higher, but some damage overlapped, where multiple hits had struck the same area, making accurate counts impossible. Both wings looked like Swiss cheese. Fabric covering on the control surfaces hung in tatters. Several ribs were completely severed. Hydraulic lines, electrical wiring, and fuel lines had been cut in multiple locations. That the wings hadn't folded under flight loads was itself miraculous. The fuselage damage was even more extensive. Cannon shells had punched completely through the aircraft, from side to side. The radio compartment was destroyed. The armor plate behind Johnson's seat had stopped at least 3 rounds that would have killed him instantly. The tail section had absorbed dozens of hits with the rudder barely attached by a few remaining fasteners. The engine told its own story. 7 of the 18 cylinders were damaged, 2 completely destroyed. Oil lines were severed in multiple places. The accessory section had taken direct hits. Cooling baffles were shredded. Yet the Pratt & Whitney R2800 had continued producing enough power to keep the aircraft flying for 17 minutes and nearly 60 miles. Republic Aviation had designed the P-47 with redundancy and survivability as core principles. But even the engineers who built it were amazed. Their worst-case scenario testing hadn't anticipated this level of damage. Half-Pint had absorbed punishment that exceeded every design parameter and kept flying. The aircraft was officially declared beyond economical repair. The structural damage was too extensive, and wartime production priorities meant it made more sense to build a new aircraft than restore this one. Half-Pint was photographed extensively for training and publicity purposes, then scrapped for parts. But those photographs would travel to every American airbase in Europe. Pilots studied them, traced their fingers over the documented holes, realized with absolute certainty that the P-47 Thunderbolt could take them home when nothing else would. Johnson was treated for burns and shrapnel wounds in the base infirmary. Doctors recommended 2 weeks of recovery. He was back in the cockpit 5 days later, flying a replacement Thunderbolt on another bomber escort mission. The word around the squadron was simple. If Johnson could survive 200 hits, none of them had any excuse for not pressing home their attacks. Robert Johnson's survival on June 26th was remarkable, but what came next proved it wasn't luck. Over the following 11 months, he systematically validated everything the P-47 Thunderbolt represented. He flew mission after mission, engaging German fighters with an aggression born from knowing exactly what his aircraft could endure. His kill count climbed steadily. By May 1944, Johnson had 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top American aces in the European theater. More significantly, he'd surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills, a benchmark that had stood for a quarter century. Johnson became the first USAAF pilot in World War II to exceed Rickenbacker's mark, an achievement that made headlines back home and boosted morale across American air forces. His tactical approach evolved directly from his June 26th experience. He understood intimately what the P-47 could survive. He used that knowledge to press attacks other pilots might have broken off. When engaging Focke-Wulf 190s, he didn't flinch when taking hits. He knew that unlike German fighters with their vulnerable liquid-cooled engines, his radial could lose cylinders and keep running. Johnson specialized in head-on attacks, a tactic that required nerves of steel. 2 fighters approaching each other head-on at a closing speed of over 600 miles per hour. You had perhaps 2 seconds to line up, fire, and break away. Most pilots couldn't handle the psychological pressure. Johnson thrived on it. His June 26th experience had burned away any fear of taking damage. The 56th Fighter Group, Johnson's unit, became the highest-scoring P-47 group in the European theater, with 674 confirmed kills by war's end. Johnson's example of aggressive tactics and faith in the Thunderbolt's durability spread throughout the group. Pilots knew that if they took hits, the aircraft would probably get them home. By May 1944, Johnson had flown 91 combat missions. He'd been recommended for rotation back to the United States multiple times, but kept volunteering for additional missions. Finally, the Army Air Forces made it an order. They needed his experience for training new pilots. They couldn't risk losing him in combat after he'd become such a valuable propaganda asset. Johnson returned to the United States in May 1944. He spent the remainder of the war touring Republic aviation factories, speaking to workers about how their craftsmanship had saved his life. His message was simple and powerful. Every rivet you set, every panel you align, every system you install could be the difference between a pilot living or dying. The workers heard him. The man standing before them was living proof that their work mattered. After the war, Johnson became a test pilot for Republic Aviation, putting his intimate knowledge of the P-47 to work, evaluating new variants and improvements. He helped develop training procedures that emphasized the Thunderbolt's survivability characteristics. His insights influenced the design of post-war fighters, particularly regarding pilot protection and structural redundancy. The German pilot who saluted Robert Johnson was never conclusively identified. Though the Egon Meyer theory remains most widely accepted, Meyer was killed in action on March 2, 1944, shot down by P-47 seconds from the 56th Fighter Group during an escort mission. He died with 102 confirmed victories, one of Germany's top aces. But his final months of combat were marked by increasing frustration with American fighter durability. Pilots couldn't destroy what refused to die. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew 546,000 combat sorties during World War II, more than any other American fighter. It destroyed 11,874 enemy aircraft, 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, but its greatest achievement might have been something the statistics can't capture. 3,499 pilots survived being shot down in P-47 seconds, a survival rate unprecedented in aviation warfare. Robert Johnson's survival on June 26, 1943, wasn't just one man's extraordinary luck. It was validation of every engineering decision Republic Aviation had made, every extra pound of armor, every redundant system, every design choice that prioritized pilot survival over marginal performance gains. And it was proof that sometimes in war, the greatest victories aren't measured in enemies killed. They're measured in friends brought home alive. Johnson lived until December 27, 1998, passing away at age 78. He'd spent decades after the war speaking about his experiences, always emphasizing the quality of American engineering and the bravery of his fellow pilots. His 1958 memoir, Thunderbolt, co-authored with Martin Caidin, became a classic of aviation literature, introducing new generations to the reality of air combat over Europe. At his funeral, 3 F-16 Fighting Falcons from the Air National Guard performed the missing man formation, a fitting tribute for a pilot who had defined what it meant to be a fighter ace. Today, several P-47 Thunderbolts remain airworthy, flying at air shows where they demonstrate the massive radial engine's distinctive sound and the aircraft's impressive performance. When aviation enthusiasts see these aircraft, they're seeing the fighter that could absorb 200 hits and still fly home. The fighter that earned a salute from an enemy who'd tried everything to bring it down and failed. That's the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. That's the story of Robert Johnson. And that's why a German ace's salute over the English Channel in 1943 became one of the most powerful moments in aviation history, a brief, shining instant when two men, separated by war and ideology, recognized in each other something that transcended both: the will to survive, the will to come home.